Test, test, test. Okay.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mark Nicotarian. I'm on the board of 5 Sparks. I want to thank everyone for coming today. We're very excited today to have David Erickson here to talk about his antique stove collection, a small subset of which is on display here and will be through February 4th. So at the conclusion of tonight's program, we're going to consolidate the chairs a little bit so you can get a peek, but please do try to come back and spend a little time and get a chance to read a little bit more about each of the beautiful pieces here in the exhibit. You'll also see that there are some pieces of woven and fiber art from the Neshoba Valley Weavers Guild, who've been generous enough to exhibit as well in conjunction with and to complement David's stoves. David contacted me a million years ago.
Pre-COVID. Everything is pre-COVID.
And told me that he had he had in his possession the stove that used to be in this very building, which used to be the public library, for those of you who don't live in Harvard may not know that. And that he was trying to make some room in his shop, or at least that's the explanation he gave me. And he wanted to know if we wanted to display it here for temporarily. I said, sounds interesting. He sent me some photos. If you didn't see it, it's right in the front room. As you leave, that beautiful stove with the big finial on top and the beautiful jewels on the front door. And from that point on, David just told me repeatedly how much he would love to have an exhibit titled Artistry in Iron. He already had the title figured out. And so we were all excited. We haven't done anything like this in the past. Most of what we display is sculpture and wall art and fiber art. And then we closed down for 18 months. And then we came back and we had David's exhibit on the schedule for this month. And I know that he's really excited to be here and to talk about his history with these beautiful pieces of art. We'll let David go through his photos and talk, and then we'll have a talk, and then we'll have a little bit of time for Q&A at the end. So, without further ado, David Erickson.
Thank you, Mark. And I am so excited to have this room full. This is this has been quite an honor and an opportunity that 5 Sparks has given me to show my stoves here. I've really pulled together the best of the best. Some of the pieces in this room I've had close to 40 years. So I do thank you all for coming, and I also thank the people who are out there on the cable. And I think there's also a YouTube feed of some sort going on. So again, thank you all. The question that so many people ask me when they either come to my shop or they meet me at Brimfield or wherever is, how did you get into such an unusual offbeat business? And it really started with that building right there, which is my shop in Littleton. It's a 1878 Boston and Maine Railroad depot that I bought in 1976. At that time, I was teaching school. I'm an industrial arts teacher. I was trained at Fitchburg State Teachers College. And I bought that building to both live upstairs, and my plan was to have a school of adults. Sold it to Helmy after I fixed it for $200. And this is at a time when I was making about $4,700 a year teaching school, so it was like a whopping windfall, extra profit. And then I did a few for a couple of friends. And then in 1980, or just prior to 1980, I fixed a couple stoves for a woman named Edie Clark from Harrisville, New Hampshire. And Edie was a freelance writer for Yankee Magazine, later to become the editor of Yankee Magazine. And Edie loved Glenwood stoves. I fixed maybe 3 or 4 stoves for her. And in 1980, she wrote a 3-page article about my business in the December issue. Again, Then they were made into iron patterns because the wood patterns, of course, would be way too delicate to use in daily, daily work. Can we change the mark to the next slide? So this is a hard one to see because it's so many different pictures, but it's from an 1880s trade newspaper for the foundry industry, and it shows a lot of the different divisions in the stove business. In the middle is a mounting room, or a pattern room is in the middle top, and there are pictures of men polishing the iron and polishing the parts. In the very center, of course, is the foundry, which were often, huge buildings. I mean, these were big industries. There were stove makers in just about every major city in the United States. From, Taunton, Massachusetts here had 7 different stove makers at one time. Albany and Troy, which was really the birthplace of the stove industry in America, started in the early 1840s. I can't even tell you how many stove makers there were between Albany and Troy. That was a lot due to the fact of the transportation of the Hudson River, of the local, what they call Albany sand, which is a very fine sand which they found, which was really good for molding, and which is what gave the fantastic fine finish. You look at the finish on all of these stoves, you can't find a foundry today that'll make something that detailed and that smooth. The fine molding sands were perfect for detail, but they were very dangerous. A lot of the molders had a molder's lung disease, a lot like coal miner disease from the sand. So the transportation, the sand, and then also the availability of local bog iron, of pure cast iron right out of the ground, was why it all got going in Albany. And that's another tribute to what the material and the longevity and durability of these stoves is due to the fact that they were all made from pure cast iron. Anything that's made from cast iron today has been a brake rotor and an engine block and, recycled from many different things. And the iron loses its strength and its purity. So I just brought along a couple of, these are from the Portland Stove Foundry in Portland, Maine. This is a master pattern. This is actually the part that was used this is an iron pattern, very smooth, fine finish. And this was the piece that was used in the foundry to put in a mold, by hand, ram the sand all around it, flip the mold over, and then very gently lift the pattern out of the sand, leaving an impression, and then the iron was poured into that mold. Now it rests on what's called a follow board, which just facilitated easy molding. So this was the bottom ash pit door of a round parlor stove, and then this would have been one of the top feed doors. Again, because of its complicated shape, they had to make this follow board. We can go to the next slide, Mark, which shows the interior of a foundry. I do business right now with a foundry in Nashua, New Hampshire, and I have another small foundry up in New Gloucester, Maine, and the inside of them hasn't changed one bit. They look exactly the same. They're dark, they're dirty. It's really hard work. The process hasn't changed much. You see, these are all the molders that are standing behind their big sand molds that they've made down on the floor. The floor molds were done with the bigger parts because the flask was too big to turn over. Smaller parts would have been done on a bench, and then the molds would have been put down on the floor. Next slide, Mark. Is this one where they're pouring? Nope, not yet. One more. Yeah, Here's where the iron, it looks like a second batch of iron is coming out of the furnace on the left there. You know, iron melts at around 2,450 degrees, so it's white hot when it comes out of the furnace. And you can see all the molds on the floor that they've already poured. They poured the molten iron into each one of the holes, which has the impression of the part they were going to make. And the iron is still glowing red in those molds. Again, a pretty dark, dingy place. Next one, Mark. Yeah, here we go. There's, you know, two guys pouring off a mold. They would fill those small crucibles with molten iron, 2,400 plus degrees, and they would go right down the aisle, and there's a pour hole that the molder has made into the flask, so the iron is all poured in. It cools, the iron solidifies, and they break the molds apart, and they do it all over again. Every time, you know, one part, one mold, one part, one mold. So it's very repetitive and slow. There's next one, Mark. Oh, just that's how many people I guess it takes to, you know, run a foundry. I love old group shots like that. Next one, Mark. Oh, those are some of the, these are just some of the little tools that the molder would have used when he'd ram his mold up, but then he would have to cut the little gateways for the iron to pour in. Sometimes when he lifted the pattern out, he might just cave in a little bit of the sand, so he would use those little tools to kind of patch. Rather than lose the mold and have to start all over again, he would make a little patch. And he had all those tools. And if you were, I read in one of these trade publications once from Albany that a molder was a very skilled and respected job. And when you if you were a molder in a foundry, when you walked home after work at night, molder would always put one of his little brass spoons, his little brass tools in his back pocket. It was kind of like a badge of recognition. And you know, for years, you know, my shop is on Taylor Street in Littleton, and what was down the other end of Taylor Street in Littleton but 4 or 5 big digital plants. And every day, the digital people would come walking down to the general store across the street, and they all had their badge, their digital badge of, I work for digital. So it was, again, a prestigious job, even though it was hard and dirty work. It was skilled, and these people demanded a lot of respect. So the other question people always ask me is, where the heck do you still find these things? I mean, it's like, I'd sniff them out under a rock or something. Well, I just go around the room with a couple of them. Just to every stove has a story, and my feeling has always been that an antique dealer's job is more to, than just, fix something or turn it over and resell it. But it's to kind of carry the story of that particular piece, to the next owner and the next generation, But the star of the show in this room is that World's Fair commemorative cook stove back by the door. And that stove, there's so few of those in the world, it's amazing. I found it in an old man's cellar in Dublin, New Hampshire. I just, from a phone call. Again, I've had it 30, 35 years, but in every single piece of it was there. It had been preserved and just wanted to sell it. The Abraham Lincoln stove, that's the little Gothic, gingerbread Gothic cottage stove right over there. It's called a Temple Parlor. That came from Brimfield. Again, some years ago, I've been doing the Brimfield Antique Show for 35 plus years, not only selling stuff there, but always buying stuff. So I found that temple at Brimfield. This Sunshine Parlor, beautiful, beautiful parlor from Portland, made in Portland, Maine by the Portland Stove Foundry, same foundry that these parts are from. That was traded into me by an old Fitchburg State, he was an industrial arts guy. He was a year or two ahead of me. But he traded it into me because his wife didn't like it was too fancy. He wanted a plainer stove, a simple. So I did a beautiful Glenwood wood parlor for him, which is from about 1908. That stove is 1890, so it didn't have as much filigree and fancy work on it. And he loved it, and his wife loved it, and I have that beautiful, rare sunshine. So it was a kind of a marriage made in heaven. This is my newest acquisition in the room. Again, a lot of these stoves I've had 25, 30 years. I just got this a couple months ago out of a cellar of a house in Fitchburg, right next to St. Bernard's High School. And super, super rare piece. I've never seen another one. It's by Smith and Anthony Stove Company that made, their trade name was Hub, H-U-B. This foundry was in Wakefield, offices were in Boston, but it's just this magnificent tile Franklin with rollback doors right in Fitchburg. And again, all there. And then the other local one is the last stove down on this side, which is the 2-column stove with the magnificent eagle on the top. Came out of a barn in Bolton. Again, somebody called me and said, he had brought it down from a family summer camp or something, and they just wanted to get rid of it. It was in bushel baskets. It was not looking like that. It was all apart. It was missing parts. Of course it was missing the eagle. And I found the eagle from another stove collector in our Antique Stove Association. We have an association of about 250 members across the country. And this one particular guy in Wisconsin specializes in finials, just the stove tops. And it was not easy to get him to part with that eagle because they're rare and it is what makes that stove that stove. And I joked with some friends of mine when I bought it, and I said, I paid more money for that eagle than I ever paid for any automobile I had until I got out of college. But again, it was the crowning glory. So, next slide, Mark. So some of the other interesting places I find stoves. This is Clapboard Island off the coast of Falmouth, Maine. It's 1 mile off the coast of Falmouth. It's a 30-acre private island. It was owned by the president of the Pennsylvania Railroad. It was his summer cottage. Next picture. Just a little 13-bedroom summer cottage. And the island was sold about 3 or 4 years ago to a really nice guy. His name is Neil. And in the caretaker's shed, there was a blue spatterware kitchen range, just a normal kitchen range, that Neil said, I'd like you to restore. So I went out to the island, we took the stove back, I restored that. And when I brought it back, Neil said to me, there's another old stove out in the barn. He said, it must have come from the house. He says, but it's all apart in pieces. It's in terrible condition. I said, well, let's go out in the barn and look at it. Next slide. So, well, I guess I mixed them up, but it doesn't matter. You can go back. Yeah, so the stove was completely apart. That's that rusty pile of stuff right there. Well, so how do we get this thing on and off the island? Well, Neil, the owner of the island, had this custom aluminum LST boat built so he could bring excavators and cement mixers and all stuff. It's like a World War II landing craft with a big drop gate. So that's the boat. So we took all the parts in a gator across the island, and I had to take everything down the ramp, because the ramp goes up and down with the tide. So we brought everything up on the top. Your next slide might show it. So yeah, there's me trying to take the big cabinet base down the ramp. That was a little scary because it was low tide, and wish we had done it at high tide, but we did it at low tide. Next slide. And hooray, I got to the bottom with it without ending up in the drink. Next slide. There we are, putting it on the aluminum LST. Next. So there's Neil pulling away with the boat, this is the town landing in Falmouth. That's the whole pile of parts for the stove right there that I then loaded in my van and went home. And next slide. That's the stove all done. The same stove. It was, it's a Spears hotel range. They're very, very, very rare. It's a double oven center firebox wood burning cook stove. And this one was an extra large one. That's why they called it a hotel range. It was for restaurants and, what have you, but also very, very wealthy people would buy them for, big estates. And that's what I put together, and it's now the star of the show of the Gilded Age. I sold it to, I think it's Netflix, and there's a show called, I don't own a television. I've been on television for 35 years, so I don't know much about what's on TV. But this is, Gilded Age is all about life of the very, very, very wealthy in the 1880s and early 1890s. So that was it. Next. Here's another cool place I pulled the stove out of. This is Fuller Hall in Hillsborough, New Hampshire. It's an absolutely untouched country community hall where people would go on Friday night. There was a stage at one end of the building with the curtain that came down, and they had plays and music. And even behind the curtain were these fabulous pull-down, hand-painted backdrops for plays from the 1880s, 1890s. They were all intact. They were beautiful. I said, these belong in the Smithsonian. They were so wonderful. Well, the stove, the next slide, the stove, which was at the other end of the hall, was a round oak number 20 with what's called an extension can. It had an extra tall section on the top of it, which was an option in the day for heating large rooms, with high ceilings, railroad depots, community halls, Grange halls, what have you. But it was missing just about everything. All it was the main body. It was missing all the boot rails, missing the trim. Next slide. And there is taking it out of the building in the next slide. So this is it all apart. Now it was incomplete, but it also was damaged. And I was lucky enough to find another round oak 20 in a friend of mine's junkyard that had almost all the parts I needed. So I put the best of two together to make one. Next slide. There's the parts after sandblasting. We have a machine called a wheel abrader, which is kind of like a microwave oven of sandblasting. I also call it the magic wand of the antique stove business, because in a minute and a half it takes the rustiest, dirtiest piece of metal and makes it brand new again. It uses fine steel grit propelled by a big slinger wheel and a big dust collector and everything. But yeah, so those are the same parts that you saw in the last slide after sandblasting. Next slide. And there it is, all back together. I found there's one boot rail is missing because it was still at the plater, but this nickel, I had both boot rails. I had the finial on, the original finial, which has the Indian face on it. That was Round Oak's logo. But some of the parts I had to get from a Round Oak collector in Portland, Oregon. But that's a really beautiful stove, and I still have it, waiting for the right home and the right person. Somebody has to have a pretty big, great room that's a Round Oak 20. That means the diameter was 20 inches at the barrel. They made them. They started at number 12s, which are just little babies for small rooms. Went all the way to number 24s, huge things. And I don't know how many of you might know Calvin Moore, my friend who owns Moore Lumber Company, and he owns the building in the center of town where the pool hall is on the second floor. Well, the original stove that heated that pool hall, which I restored for Calvin and his mom many years ago, was a Round Oak 24 with a double can, the biggest one they made. And he has it on display over there. So yeah, these double can stoves, don't see them very much. Next slide. So the rest of the process, you saw some of it already with the round oak. This was a wonderful couple that I sold this Glenwood home grand to. They were in their mid to later 80s, and they bought a brand new Glenwood cook stove. And they bought the top of the line. They bought the Glenwood home grand. You know, they had an old cook stove, you know, in that place that was just, you know, falling apart. And they came to visit me, and he was so proud to buy his wife, you know, a brand new cook stove, and also buy the, you know, the home grand was like the El Dorado to Cadillac. Next slide. So that would be the stove, again, complete. This is part of our process. Complete disassembly, ready to go to the sandblaster. Next slide. The same parts after sandblasting. Next slide. My Rockstar Keith, assembling it, re-cementing. You can see some of the furnace cement, the sealing compound that makes all the joints tight again, all brand new bolts and screws and everything. Literally, when that stove leaves our shop, it's the same condition that it left the factory in 1908. Next. It's another one I did for some folks up in Maine, really interesting couple. They're actually from Texas. Next slide. You know, next slide. All right, same. Next. This is where it gets good. There's Keith putting that one together. He's made a brand new steel shell. You know, these round oak parlor heaters were cast iron, but they always had a steel shell or a steel body. And we have a sheet metal shop. We make all brand new ones. So he's cementing all that back together. Next. There it is, all done. This was a family heirloom. This was the husband's grandfather's stove. As rusty and as horrible as it was when we started, he took it, he carried it with him everywhere he's ever lived and said, someday I'm going to get that stove fixed. And they found me. And in this picture, I mean, it's all done, but it's missing one of the finial arms on the right-hand side. And I delivered it to him this way, and then I went back later and took the finial arm off, and I brought it to a brass foundry, and the foundry guy did a beautiful job of replicating it, so it now has a complete finial. And she's a little eclectic, the wife. This was the kind of a contemporary tile job with an 1890s stove in front of it. The house is, next slide. This is the house that it's in. It's in Cape Elizabeth, Maine. It's a huge sea captain's house that came from Skowhegan, Maine. They bought that house 90 miles from Cape Elizabeth to Skowhegan. They bought that house and they cut it into quadrants. And they moved each section here, put a brand new foundation in, and reassembled the whole house. I mean, it's amazing. Next slide. And that's, they have they're on a knoll with a beautiful view of the ocean. Yeah. So, everybody says, well, what's your marketing strategy? Well, I've never really been much of an internet person or a computer person. I like to say that my marketing strategy came from a combination of my high school industrial arts program, where I was kind of a rock star in industrial arts, and I wasn't really much in the English and chemistry department. But every year we had a fair. Fitchburg State College put on a fair for high school industrial arts programs, and we all brought our projects there. You know, high schools from all over the state, and I would so look forward to this show. You know, it was like show and tell, and so I've always been a meet and greet kind of guy, and this is one of the ways I've been selling my stoves for almost 38 years. This is my booth at Brimfield. I choose to lug this heavy, complicated stuff to various fairs and set up like that. And somebody, oh, Dwayne Barber said he had seen me and met me at Brimfield, and it's what sustained me all these years. People come back sometimes to my shop 10 years later and said, I saw your stuff at Brimfield and now we're ready to renovate our kitchen and we want one of your stoves. You know? Next slide. Another Brimfield. The green and cream Glenwood is a six burner gas range from 1926. You know, so I ranged the whole gamut of eras. The parlor stoves are all late 1890s, 1900. Next slide. Well, missed one. I think there's, we back up one? Back up one more? There it is. Then it's kind of a color clash in this booth. I don't know what I was thinking. I had that royal blue Bengal wood gas combination kitchen range, and then on the other side of it I had that fire engine red 1953 Chambers, which now resides in a beautiful oceanfront house up in Gloucester. And then in the middle is, yeah, Sam Rouse's Whirly 100. The one in the middle is a parlor stove with isinglass windows all the way around, big, huge lions' faces on the corners and serpents on the front corners. And it made by the Whirly Stove Company in Newark, Ohio, which made all the stoves for Sears Roebuck. If you look at an old Sears Roebuck catalog, remember Sears used to have good, better, best, you know, and everything in the catalog? Well, the Whirly 100 was Sears Best. And then they made it in 3 sizes, 14, 16, and 18. Baby bear, mama bear, papa bear. That was a number 18. Now owned by my very good customer and friend, Sam Rouse, the former owner of Very Fine Juice Company, my next door neighbor down at Littleton. Next slide. Okay. And now this is, I also do indoor shows. This is the picture was taken at the New Hampshire Preservation Alliance Old House Restoration Fair, which happens every other year in an armory up in Manchester, New Hampshire. Great show. It's like a home show for old house people. You know, there aren't any hot tubs or, you know, those kind of things there. It's people who just come looking for the services of people who restore old homes. And I've always done well. There's a gorgeous, very rare that Franklin on the left with the brass gallery is probably 1825. Really, with a Wilson heat dome. That dunce cap thing on the top was actually an additional radiator. You know, the smoke from the fire would go up inside of that. It didn't go anywhere, but it was more surface area. Those are just almost non-existent now. Wilson heat dome. That's real museum stuff. Next. That's the rest of my booth, that show in Manchester. Next. Main Boat Home and Harbor Show in Rockland. This is also, people say, what the hell is a stove guy doing at a boat show? Well, you know, people who like boats and people who like hot rods and people who like motorcycles often like this stuff too. You know, I find customers, you know, far and wide from different venues. Stoves are really mechanical, collectible things. Next. This is about repurposing. You know, it's getting hard to keep peddling this stuff in this because of EPA regulations and changes in building codes and emissions regulations and all. And straight wood stoves have now become pretty much completely illegal by a new EPA regulation that went in last March. But there's loopholes. Kitchen cook stoves are exempt. Coal stoves are exempt, so any big potbelly stove is fine. But then you can also convert, I convert a lot of things, I call repurposing, to either gas or electric. And this is 19 Carter. I don't know if any of you know of this place. It's in right on the Common in Berlin. And this was an absolute derelict old church that was kind of overgrown, and it had sat for so long. Always had an eye for this building. Well, it's a story of success, like I can't get into it all, but it was completely restored by volunteers and by money that was raised by GoFundMe kind of things, and it's incredible. They jacked the whole building up in the air, put a whole new foundation under it, faced the foundation in brick so it would look period. So now they have classroom area and everything underneath. And the upstairs is a community center. It's one great big room. They have music in there, they have plays in there, they have all. During the week they have teas and coffees and things. Next slide. So they bought from me a great big potbelly stove with an extra extension can on the top that would have come out of a building like that, or a railroad depot, or what have you. And that's a big stove. The picture doesn't do it justice. But they bought it as sort of a auxiliary heater for the room. And in the renovation, the architect told them they still had to put in an extremely expensive, super high efficient propane furnace system to heat the building. The stove was just going to be like a little attraction. Next slide. So you can kind of get a feel for the size of the room there. The pipe goes all the way, it's all the way up through the ceiling. Well, go to the next slide and then we'll back. Whoop, 1, 2. So we converted this to gas. It has a 90,000 BTU gas burner in it with an automatic thermostat, safety pilot and control. Backwards 1 now. And can we back up, Mark, 1? So you can see the chairs and tables all around in that big room. And Evie Dubeck, who is the woman tornado behind this whole project, tells me that whenever they have an event, they'll have people show up a half an hour early just to get the seats by the stove. They're the coveted seats by the stove. And here's the thing. They put in the fancy, expensive heating system. They almost never use it. The potbelly stove heats the whole building. It's crazy. And it does it efficiently and what have you. So yeah, there's how we're repurposing some of our stoves by gas. Go ahead on. This is about a 1924 or 25 hot point. It was originally a 6-burner, double oven, all electric stove. In 1926, an electric stove was so cutting edge, high tech, it was amazing. Nobody had electric, it was just coming in. So it had these real archaic 6 electric burners on it, and the interior was all rotted out, but it's very noteworthy. So we restored it, and we cut out the cooktop where the 6 burners were with an abrasive saw, and we put in a brand new induction electric cooktop. So it's a space age 6-burner induction cooktop. Next slide. Whoop, no, you go too many. Yeah, that's okay. We might have. It also has two fully functioning electric ovens in it, and it's in a gentleman's home over in Lunenburg. He's had it for a couple of years. He just loves it. This project was. This is the original factory catalog for this stove. It was called the Perfect, Richardson and Boynton Stove Company in New York. It was gas. It was a gas stove on the left with 4 gas burners, gas oven underneath, and a wood-burning stove on the right, wood-burning firebox in the middle, wood-heated oven on the bottom. And then up top, it had a gas broiler on the left and just a warming, like a sliding door warming on the right. Next slide. Oh, yep. So that's what it looked like. It sat down in the cellar of my barn for about 10 years. This one came from the factory in gray porcelain, which was a pay extra option in the day. Porcelain was in very bad condition, so we had to take it all apart. Next slide. and we sandblasted the porcelain off somewhat laboriously. It's very difficult to get that porcelain off. It's fused glass. And we turned it back into a black stove again because it could have been ordered as a black stove. But keep on going. And so the gas, I think the gas burners are on the left. One more frame. There are the 4 original functioning, gas burners, nice big heavy-duty gas burners. They'll be around for this owner's grandchildren. This stuff never wears out. Next slide. There's the overhead, like salamander gas broiler that was up on the left. Sear a steak in faster than you can blink. Next. And then what we did, that's where the wood box used to be. Where you lift the lids and put, or coal, whatever. We put a 2,000 watt electric heating element in it. She still has the 4 gas burners. Now she has 2 more lids on the right, which she can use for sauteing or heating. The electric element doesn't heat up as fast as the gas burner does, but it's a good place. And it gives her it turned a 4-burner stove into a 6-burner stove. Down below, next one. We changed the ovens all to electric. And Keith, my sheet metal wizard, that's his handiwork inside, all brand new stainless steel ovens. Next. Some of the places that I've restored and done stoves for, somewhat famous. This is called a brick set range. They were stoves that were not freestanding. They were actually built into the brick. Stoves of the very wealthy. Next. This one was this is a Massachusetts governor's mansion down in Westwood, Mass. Was bought by a doctor and did an amazing restoration, renovation. And we did this. We had to do the stove in place. We didn't take it out of the brick, so it was many, many trips back and forth to make that stove look like you just saw it. Next. This is right here in Harvard. The oldest house in Harvard, on the corner of 110 and Bear Hill Road, that old red house that been under restoration for a number of years and I think just recently sold. That's the gold medal Glenwood with a gas heater in the firebox that I did for that project. Next. The famous Steven Tyler, the musician, singer. That's a parlor stove I did for him at a little cottage he has up in New Hampshire, converted to gas. It was originally a coal stove. Now has a gas burner in it. Next. That was my stove. That was in my kitchen my children grew up in front of that. We did every Thanksgiving turkey and Easter ham and everything. It's a McGee double oven Kitchener. Again, a center firebox double oven stove made by McGee Stoves here in Boston. I had it 20 years. And next slide. I was contacted by the Long Year Museum, the curator of all of the Mary Baker Eddy properties here in Boston. And this is an old photograph from Mary Baker Eddy's kitchen in Newton. There's a magnificent stone mansion. And she had a McGee double oven Kitchener, and they were remodeling the kitchen, and they wanted one. I said, well, I don't know where there's one except in my kitchen. We went around for a while, and finally I caved. But it now sits exactly in that same spot. And they still had the little, she had a wood cook stove to the right. She had a little 4-burner gas stove to the left. And that stove still existed. So not only did I sell them my stove, I also restored the gas stove. So the kitchen still looks exactly as it did. McSorley's Ale House. This is the infamous McSorley's Ale House, the oldest bar room in New York City. They didn't allow women in there until the 1970s. They only served one thing. They served McSorley's Ale, dark or light. You can't get a vodka and tonic or anything. It's been in business since 1854 or something like that. The interior has never changed. Nothing has ever been moved or taken out of there. Next slide. It was heated by that pot belly. The name of the pot belly is Monica. Says it right down on the front, Monica. That was just the model name. The guy standing with the guitar in his hand is Woody Guthrie. Yeah, it's a pretty famous. McSorley's a very famous place. A lot of presidents have been in there. I mean, the walls are just covered with pictures and autographs. Next. You know, it's a long, there's the stove again on the left. It's a very long and very narrow bar. And then next, there's me standing where Woody Guthrie was standing. I've been taking care of that stove since the early 1990s. They heat the bar with coal, have heated the bar with coal, and how they get away with it in New York City, I don't know, but they do. And I have done a lot of work on, actually overhauled that stove 2 times. And I go down periodically just to maintain it. Anyway, that's the Whirly 100 of a little better picture than the one in Brimfield. That's the real fancy Sears and Roebuck Whirly with the lions and the dolphins. Coal burner. Next. This is a project we just finished a week and a half ago. The Barking Crab, a restaurant down on the south end, not the south end, the Seaport District. You know, funky restaurant, and you know, especially compared to all the development that's going on around it. But they also heat that restaurant with wood, and they had an old stove in that spot, but it was really dilapidated and it got condemned. So they came out and bought this Oak Andes from me, and they love it. Next. My newest interest. You know, whenever I met people, I walk. You know, I don't have a smartphone. I'm a flip phone guy with an iPad. Whenever I meet people, all I want to show them is pictures of my old motorcycles and pictures of my old stoves. Well, no more. When I meet people now, all I do is show them pictures. This is Lucas, my little friend. He's 6 months old. He lives in Berkeley, California, and I'm going to see him in 2 weeks. Anyway, do I have a little more time, or where are we at?
I think we're at Q&A.
Q&A? Okay. So then without any further ado, I was going to brag about some of the movies I have stoves in, but that's okay. I've done enough bragging. Well, I did Force Little Women. I did a lot of stoves when you shot Little Woman right here in town. Boardwalk Empire. I did quite a few for Boardwalk Empire. Mildred Pierce. Did a bunch of things. Mildred Pierce is what pulled me through the recession of 2011, 2012. I did a lot of work with them when things weren't good. And then just recently, The Gilded Age.
See if you were mentioned, but you aren't.
So, are we ready, Mark? In an old gas stove, if you keep it gas, you have to replace, I guess, 2 questions. You have to replace every piece of the gas piping. And if that old gas piping was in perfect condition, would those stoves still be up to code, or has code changed a lot? The question is an old gas stove still viable, or do all the components need to be changed? And then, of course, do they meet the current gas codes? Most vintage gas ranges, the original components, which would be the heavy-duty cast iron burners that kind of shape like a starfish, the white porcelain gas valve handles are all perfectly viable, just need to be rebuilt, sandblasted, repainted, valves all re-greased and what have you. what you get into with the codes is that Grandma used to light everything with a match, and that's frowned upon. So every vintage gas range now has to have an automatic safety pilot, affixed for the oven circuit. In other words, there's a thermal sensor and a pilot and a red button, just like a hot water heat, gas hot water heater. You have to hold the button down and light the pilot. So we install those kind of devices to bring it up to code. In most places in the civilized world, that's enough. In Massachusetts, we go before the state regulatory board on a stove-by-stove basis for a variance. And I mean, I've been doing it for a long time. I have a pretty good working relationship with the board. They know my work. So it's a process, that just has to be done. And it's not a bad thing. Next.
Hi, Dave. Are you taking new stoves to work on?
Some. Okay, I have to repeat your question for the camera. The question is, am I taking on new work? And yes, I am, limited. We're a year backlogged with big jobs. But I've been taking it, like I took in a small parlor stove job 2 weeks ago, and I delivered it the other day because it was a small job, kind of worked in between the cracks, and I worked on it all last Sunday myself, just to get it out the door. So yeah, on a selective basis, I am still taking, sure I have to take in work, but I got to be careful of getting overloaded. There's a lot of work around. And my other antique stove friends, my friends in Rhode Island at the Antique Stove Hospital, my friend down in on Cape Cod, and my friends up in Nashua, New Hampshire, Stanley Iron Works, all of us are the same. We're just, overwhelmed with work. It's good. When it's good work. Yes?
The stove over here has an interesting crank feature on it. Can you tell us what that is?
Yeah. The stove, of course, is the World's Fair commemorative cook stove, but the accessory item on the top is a coffee bean roaster. And it's a cast iron kettle, if you will, with a cover on it. And you would take out the lid of the stove and set it down over the firebox so that the pan would be exposed to more heat. Put the coffee beans in there, green coffee beans, and then there's a crank. The crank turns a little couple of fingers like an agitator because, of course, you have to keep the beans moving or they'll burn. So it's probably circa 1860s, maybe 1870s. That's how people roasted coffee beans at home.
I actually have another question. I think moving these stoves is no joke. Do you want to talk about that?
You know what the blessing is for moving them here? The handicap ramp. Oh my God, it made it so much easier, than the flight of stairs up front. I have two other guys, my brother Robbie, who's 10 years younger than me and 6 inches taller than me, and my right-hand man Keith, who's a big guy. And we use four-wheel roll-around dollies. Of course, they all come apart. That cook stove, the back shelf comes off, all the doors and the lids come off, the main body comes off the base. So they get broken down into more manageable components. Yeah, no, and it's a lot of work, but it's what I do. Oh, one more, and then I'll...
But Dave, you're calling a lot of these parlor stoves.
Yeah.
Does that mean they're more decorative than heat the whole house? What's the definition?
No, I'm sorry, the question is, I'm calling them parlor stoves, and what does that really mean? Are they serious heaters or just A parlor stove was just a generic industry term for stoves that were heating stoves for any particular room or whatever. A good number of the heaters in this room are probably 1 or 2 room heaters. You know, the Portland Sunshine, that's a 25-inch firebox. That's a big stove. That's easily a 2,000 square foot heater on wood. But like these Franklins are, you know, maybe a couple of rooms, you know, 1,000 square feet. But then there are parlor stoves like the big round ones, like the one I did for the house in Maine. I mean, that's an easy whole house heater. So they made stoves for, you know, all purposes. A gentleman here in the crowd somewhere came up and showed me a little while ago a picture of a potbelly stove that he was thinking about selling. And then I looked, and he had a picture of a coal hod, you know, one of those buckets to pour coal, next to the stove, and the stove wasn't much taller than the coal hod. It was just a little teeny potbelly like that. One little room, maybe a railroad gate tender shanty it was used in. You know, back then, everything had to have a stove for heat. There was no other. There wasn't no electric baseboard. You had to have a stove. So sometimes you only needed a little stove. Other times you needed a big beast with double can round oak, you know. Oh, I'm sorry.
Is there someone else here?
Front row next.
Okay. Coming.
Thank you.
Oh.
Can you explain how cooking on these stoves is different than today?
Well, you know, on a wood cook stove, you regulate, again, the question is the difference between cooking on an antique wood burning stove versus anything modern. And on a wood burning, I don't know how to cook on a modern stove, so I can't really compare, because all I've ever had is antique stoves. But like on a wood burning cook stove, the firebox is traditionally always on the left. And you know, there are 6 burners, two of them are over the fire. So those are your high heat burners. And then as you progressively slid the pans to the right, as the heat circulated away from the firebox and went down under the oven, the lids would get cooler. And then after the heat went down and under the oven and all around and came back up the side of the oven to go into the chimney, it passed by the back right burner. Put it on the back burner. Came from, it's the coolest burner, it's the last one to get the heat after it's been all the way around the stove. So that's, you know, that's your coolest place. So the oven, wood burning ovens always tend to be a little hotter on the left side than they do on the right, because the fire's on the left. So if you're making a turkey or a chicken or even a loaf of bread, you need to revolve it periodically so it cooks evenly. Some ranges, Crawford stoves made here in Boston, had a wonderful thing called a basting rack, and I have one hanging on my kitchen wall because it's the most beautiful piece of decorative sculpture. It's a fancy round grate, all curly-Q. It has a little pivot in the middle, and in the bottom of the oven there was a little pocket for it to sit. It was a Lazy Susan. That you put it on the bottom of the oven and you could rotate the things in the bottom, nice and easy. But it's a beautiful piece of art.
You talked about your business and your collection, and I'm wondering how does the stove make the collection?
So the question is, how does a stove become, you know, part of my collection from business? Passion. I mean, and they come and they go, you know. I mean, I've sold a lot of stoves, you know, that I originally had as collection. You have to thin the herd from time to time, and something new comes in and can only only have room for so many. I have more. I'm actually going to try to purchase like a large 4-place enclosed snowmobile trailer in the next week, in anticipation of what am I going to do with all this stuff when I take it out of here after the exhibit, because it took me a month to gather it all together from various places. Some were in my bedroom and some were in, storage, and some, they didn't all look like this. I worked pretty hard to get them all, presentable. But, and I'm hoping that maybe I can find a few other historical museums or what have you that might like the traveling David Dog and Pony show. I'd like to show some more of these to the world. I've spoken to 19 Carter in Berlin. I don't think they have room for this much, but maybe for some less. 25 years ago, I had a few of my stoves in the List Museum of the Visual Arts in MIT, and I'm thinking about reaching out to List again to see if I might be able to, do something with them. I don't know. I'm open for ideas and suggestions. I don't want to just cast it to the wind, Okay.
Dave, about burning coal, these are beautiful stoves, and you wouldn't want to burn them. I heard that sometimes if people burn them too hot, they burn them out.
Oh, yeah.
And I don't know about that, some of them might be built. That's the first part. The second part is the mid-part, or is it mid-part, coal gas? It doesn't seem, is that really a danger? Should it be a danger?
Well, the first part of the question was, does burning coal, can damage a stove, because it is capable of getting, runaway hot, turn the stove red hot and do damage. And I've certainly seen a lot of that in my years. There really aren't any coal. This Franklin is a coal stove. It's really the only coal stove in the room. Oh, the round parlor stove way out in the front corner by the fireplace, that's coal stove. And of course, the stove that was the original stove to this library, the estate oak radiator, that was a coal stove. They're all in perfect condition. They're 120 years old, no cracks in them. So you've got to do that kind of damage, you have to really be abusive, like to burn out. If the stove is properly maintained and has the correct liners and parts in it, go a long time. You need to replace the grates periodically. I mean, you buy a new car, you don't expect to change the tires and the brake shoes once in a while. It's the same thing. Coal gas. That's the second question, was coal emits carbon monoxide, coal gas, just like oil furnace emits carbon monoxide. Your gas stove in your kitchen emits carbon monoxide when it burns. Yeah. If the stove is properly installed, connected to a chimney, I mean, I've been burning coal in my home and burning coal at my shop for 35 years. I'm still here. It's an old, it's not fashionable anymore, Most people have Priuses and Teslas. Us coal burners are going by the wayside. But, I have a lot of customers who are coal burners. I buy coal from Leominster Coal and Ice, and Calvin Moore sells coal too at Moore Lumber. It was hard to get coal this year. There was kind of almost like a run on coal. So there's still a lot of people out there that use it. It's a wonderful, wonderful, slow burning, easy to take care of heat.
You want to just talk about the books that you brought?
Oh, yes, yeah. So, yeah, I brought 2 copies of one book, which is Cast with Style, and this was written by Tamis Groft. She's the curator director of the Albany Institute of History and Art, which has the biggest collection of magnificent Albany stoves in the whole country. If you're ever out in Albany, this is really a great museum. So you could just, I'm going to put them out on the coffee table out in the void. You can just kind of thumb through and you know, because there's a lot of really cool stoves here, which, you know, I don't, you know, have examples of. And then this is an extremely rare book. This was the first book ever written about stoves by a woman named Josephine Pierce. I think it was written in the early 60s. And this was a woman who was fascinated with stoves and did a, you know, a very extensive write-up. This is a good book. This is a rare book. Well, yeah, so I would, just while we talk about museums, can I just, two little things. Some of the stoves where we have put back into museums, I've done a fair amount of business with the Henry Ford Museum out in Detroit. They've got, Henry Ford was a phenomenal stove collector. When he traveled around the country in the 20s, he, you know, picked up just about everything and anything, and that's what, you know, in the Henry Ford Museum in Greenfield Village. But there's an enormous collection of American stoves in Henry Ford. The Albany Institute of Art, I just mentioned, great collection of stuff. I sold some stoves to the National Park Service. They're in Walden Pond, in the little cabin. That stove came from me. And the Lowell boarding house has 3 or 4 stoves that I placed for them. And in the JFK's homestead in Brookline, they came to me years ago and said, they showed me a picture of the original stove, which was gone. It was of gold medal Glenwood, the same stove that's in the house down in Still River, and I had one. So I've got that exact model in JFK's house. So yeah, I'm done. Yeah. Thank you.
Once again, I want to thank Dave for sharing stories and some of the history about stoves here in the exhibit, as well as about his life with these stoves. Dave has been extremely generous with his time. Extremely generous with his time and helping us get set up, and he has stopped in repeatedly while the exhibit's been up to check on things, to bring people on little private tours and answer questions. So before you head out, if you want to just take a quick peek at what's here in the room or in the front, please do. We're open this week from Tuesday to Thursday from 12 to 6 in the afternoon, on Friday from 12 to 3, and we'll be open on Saturday from 12 to 6. And then is that it? No, the following week. The exhibit's up until the 4th, so I guess that's another week after that. So please do stop in. I'll just, because Dave's probably not going to tell you, but some of the stoves that are here in the exhibit are actually for sale. So if you're interested, please talk with Dave or talk with one of the volunteers at the front desk during the week when you stop and visit.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for coming. Thank you.